Inti was the name that the Inca gave to their sun. It was a warm sun that burned brightly in the cold Andean climate. The warmth felt good against my face, and I turned my head so as to take as much of the sun in as I could. I sat on the ground with my back resting firmly against an ancient wall. Even through my sweater, I could feel the fine fit of the stone blocks. The Inca had built strong walls, as even now they stand. From where I sat, I could look across the central plaza that was the heart of Machu Picchu. The stone architecture crowded in on the plaza from every side. In the background, Huayna Picchu, the young mountain, stood silently watching, as if awaiting the Inca's return. There were not many tourists at the ruins this particular morning, and there were no Inca at all. How odd it was to be here alone. The train from Cusco had been so crowded the day before. I knew that the visitors had all returned to the city the previous evening, but I had not seen any of them depart. It was as if they had become part of the mystery that is Machu Picchu. From my vantage point, I watched the sun cast shadows of clouds across the Andean landscape. It was peaceful, and such a wonderful way to spend a morning. I thought about how fortunate I was to be in such a place. Even when a child, I had dreamed of visiting Machu Picchu. It had always been a magnet pulling me toward it. It was one of the reasons I became an archaeologist. And now, here I was, with my back against an Inca wall and the Andean sun against my face. While watching the shadows on the distant mountains, I realized what a nice photograph it would make. I got up and found the perfect view with my camera, then began to compose the photograph. Just as I took the picture, I heard a sudden rustling beside me. The noise startled me, and on looking, I found a large alpaca standing nearby. The alpaca was white and sported a thick winter coat of luxurious wool. It would have been an exceptionally beautiful animal had it not soiled itself by wallowing in the mud. Regardless, I thought it was a remarkable animal, and certainly worth a photograph. I lifted my camera, fearing that the alpaca might run away. Fortunately, the animal moved only a short distance. As I watched, it looked back at me and then paused in what seemed to be an intentional pose. I took my photograph of the animal, realizing that with the ruins of Machu Picchu in the background, it would be a classic image. As soon as I had taken the photograph, the alpaca moved a slight distance away, then repositioned itself for what seemed to be an even better photograph. I took the second picture, then a third, and a fourth, each one slightly different from the others, and each characterized by magnificent scenery and a posing alpaca. After a while, I grew tired of photographing the alpaca, and I put my camera away. On seeing this, the animal walked slowly toward me, then stood there as if expecting something. I had grown accustomed to negotiating with the Peruvian people before taking their photographs, but I had never once thought it was necessary to do that with an animal. The alpaca stood its ground, and then it began to act threatening. I was bewildered and decided to search through my day pack, hoping to find some forgotten morsel of food to offer the seemingly hostile animal. I could find nothing. The alpaca grew more offensive. I actually thought that he was going to attack me. I could well imagine the newspaper headlines back home in California. Local man trampled to death by angry alpaca. The alpaca stared at me for what seemed to be the longest time, but finally grew tired of the encounter. With a sharp grunt, it turned and disappeared up a long flight of steps. I was relieved to be alone again, and I kept looking over my shoulder to make certain that I was alone. I was embarrassed, too. I did not want to be seen as the ugly American. While in Peru, I had tried hard not to insult anyone. But now, I'd gone and offended this poor alpaca. That afternoon, I boarded the train for my return to Cusco. As the train made its way back up the Rio Urubamba, I thought about my wonderful experiences at Machu Picchu. By far, the most delightful occurrence had been my encounter with the alpaca. It seemed like such a magical event that I began to wonder if I dreamed it. Perhaps it was one of those rare events when the real world intermingles temporarily with the world of magic and mystery. We're better than Machu Picchu. While on the train, I began to realize that what I had first taken to be an almost mystical encounter was probably something quite different. I remembered an Indian woman I had photographed at Sacsayhuaman, the great Inca fortress overlooking Cusco, just a few days earlier. She stood with her llama, and they both posed for my photograph. The llama had seemed just as serious in its pose as was the woman. I had noticed the same thing when photographing a young boy with his alpaca in Cusco. Now I wondered if my white alpaca was more accustomed to tourists than I had first imagined. It dawned on me that the animal was probably a resident of Machu Picchu and used to take in handouts from tourists. It seemed just as probable that it had learned to distinguish tourists with cameras from those without them. Furthermore, by standing in certain places and holding a pose, the animal might have learned that it would be rewarded more often by tourists with cameras than by those without them. After all, everyone is willing to pay for that one-in-a-million photograph. I laughed as I thought about my classic pictures. There were probably hundreds just like them, taken by visitors to Machu Picchu from every corner of the world. With that realization, I turned my thoughts back to the journey ahead of me, and soon I was lost among the towering Andes.